Was Lewis Hamilton a victim of double standards by the FIA in Mexico? What if I told you that the leaked telemetry suggests he should never have been penalized? The 10-second penalty that the stewards imposed on Hamilton changed the fate of that afternoon. From third position, he fell to eighth. On paper, it's just a number. But in practice, it was a conviction that completely altered the development of the championship and exposed the deepest cracks in Formula One's regulatory system. A maneuver that until then was considered within the competitive margin of a wheel-to-wheel battle was reinterpreted hours later as gaining undue advantage. Without an accident, no damage, safely. Interpretation only, and that was enough to destroy an entire weekend's work. The impact was immediate. Hamilton's statements, full of disappointment and annoyance, were just the beginning. His direct accusation against the FIA for applying a double standard was not a random phrase. It was a bomb dropped with intention, with history behind it, with open wounds that neither the passage of time nor the internal changes of the Federation have managed to close. Because it wasn't just about losing positions. It was the feeling of helplessness in the face of a structure that, once again, seemed to tip the balance at key moments. What made everything explode was the inevitable comparison. Verstappen and Leclerc, in that same race, executed similar maneuvers, with even more obvious departures from the track, without returning positions, and without penalty. And then it was no longer just Hamilton versus the stewards. It was a new episode of what many consider the most serious structural problem of modern F1, the lack of coherence in the application of the regulations. What was at stake was not just a result. It was the symbolic value of a performance. It was Hamilton's first opportunity to show that he is still relevant, that he can still build something historic with Ferrari. But instead of celebration, there was frustration. Instead of answers, doubts. And instead of unity, a new front of conflict opened between drivers, teams, and the FIA. One that threatens to spread beyond the Mexican asphalt and irreversibly set the tone for the rest of the 2025 season. To really understand what happened in Mexico, it is not enough to look at the replay of the incident. You have to go further. You have to get into the cockpit with Hamilton, see what he saw, feel what he felt, and, above all, analyze what the cold numbers reveal. Because an image can be deceiving, but telemetry doesn't lie. The data collected from SF25 and onboard recordings provide a completely different perspective, one that dismantles the official narrative and opens a new chapter in the debate on sports justice. It all begins on lap 6, at a moment that was already tense in itself. Hamilton and Verstappen, two gladiators with history, were approaching turn 1 after a chaotic first sector. 4 cars entered practically parallel to the first apex. And from the chaos, Hamilton emerged on the outside and Verstappen launched himself on the inside with calculated aggressiveness. Telemetry shows that the Dutch driver manages to position his front axle just a few centimeters in front of Hamilton's right mirror right at the apex. According to the letter of the regulation, that could be considered right of line. But in practice, they were both entering an area without space, without ideal traction, and with a tactical scenario evolving second by second. The Real trigger comes in turns 2 and 3. Verstappen cuts the chicane almost completely on the grass, while Hamilton tries to stay close to the limits of the track. But both are forced into an improvised escape. Up to that point, everything was interpretable. The decisive thing happens a few meters later in turn 4. There, Hamilton sees the opportunity to recover the lost space and tries to do it on the outside. It is a risky maneuver, but technically clean. And then the unexpected happens. The SF25 blocks the right front wheel just as it passes through a dirty area of the track, a detail that may seem minor, but that changes the entire scenario. That small block, 0.3 seconds lost according to telemetry, forced Hamilton to take the only viable route left without crashing or going completely off, the grass. And that was where the great dilemma arose. Because by cutting through that area, the Ferrari managed to rejoin ahead of Verstappen. There was no contact. There was no accident. There was no direct overtaking, but it was a gain in position that, in the eyes of the commissioners, was not restored. Now, why wasn't the position returned? Why did Hamilton continue? The technical data leaked by Ferrari's entourage explains a panorama that the stewards seem to have ignored. The SF25 was experiencing grip problems under extreme temperatures. The Mexican track registered more than 53 degrees Celsius on the asphalt, and the car's setup was not designed to deal with so much dirt off the line. In addition, the telemetry shows that the aerodynamic load in the curve of Hamilton's car was above what was estimated, causing an entry with more speed than recommended in an area of variable adhesion. Added to this, the RPM and acceleration data reveal a crucial detail. At no point did Hamilton completely lift the accelerator when returning to the track. This was interpreted by the stewards as a lack of intention to return the position. But in the technical and competitive context, that decision could also be interpreted as an attempt not to lose pace and avoid being trapped behind Behrman's Haas, who had surprisingly gotten between the two contenders, taking advantage of the disorder. The question many are asking is whether Hamilton really had the time, visibility, and information to know for sure whether or not he should give up the position. Because when you're behind the wheel at over 250 kilometers per hour, with the radio still silent and the visual reference distorted by dust and passing, making a perfect decision in seconds is something that, frankly, not even the best simulators in the world can accurately replicate. And this is where the narrative changes. Because if this maneuver had been executed by another pilot in another circumstance, would the verdict have been the same? The same FIA that sanctions Hamilton for not returning position after exiting onto the grass is the same one that minutes before did not sanction Verstappen for completely cutting a chicane without yielding. Inconsistency is what transforms a simple mistake into an institutional storm. Because when the data is so clear, when telemetry exposes technical causes and not intentions, penalizing ceases to be a question of justice and becomes a question of judgment. A criterion that today, for many, was discredited. Several hours passed from when the checkered flag fell at the Autodromo Hermanos Rodriguez until the FIA issued the official statement. But when it arrived, document number 36 only added fuel to the fire. Using technical language, but surprisingly brief for the magnitude of the case, the sports stewards established that Lewis Hamilton gained a significant advantage when leaving the track and did not give it back. That was the basis for applying a 10-second penalty. A phrase that, although it seems sufficient on paper, leaves open more questions than answers when put under the magnifying glass of the technical, regulatory, and competitive context. To begin with, the FIA justified its decision in the interpretation of Article 27.3 of the sporting regulations, which establishes that a driver cannot leave the track limits and obtain a lasting advantage as a result. Until then, there is no discussion. The problem arises from the subjective application of the term significant advantage, and even more serious, from the selectivity with which this criterion seems to have been applied in Mexico. Because if you review the entire lap, including onboard, telemetry, and position maps, you will see that Hamilton not only did not overtake clearly when leaving the track, but he avoided a collision, lost traction, and upon returning he found a chaotic scenario in which even Oliver Behrman's Haas slipped between him and Verstappen. Where is the significant advantage? Furthermore, the FIA report completely omits to consider the external factors that condition the action. The lack of visibility, the state of the asphalt outside the racing line, the brake pressure in a dirty area, and the total absence of a radio indication that would help the driver make an informed decision about whether he should give up position. There was no team instruction. There was no real-time relative position analysis. Just a static interpretation of a dynamic situation. And here lies the heart of the problem. Because while Hamilton was sanctioned with absolute rigor, Max Verstappen executed a similar maneuver also off the track, also without giving back the advantage, without even receiving a warning. That disparity set off alarms in the paddock. How can the same rule be applied differently depending on the driver, the team, or the media context? The contradiction becomes even more evident when looking at past incidents, in which out-of-limits maneuvers have been treated with totally different criteria. In many of them, the stewards chose to let it go, arguing that the situation was a race, or that there was no clear intention to gain an advantage. Why then, in Hamilton's case, was intent not assessed? Why were the technical factors that showed that the British driver momentarily lost control of the car due to causes beyond his control not considered? Beyond the penalty, what outrages the teams, analysts, and fans is the lack of coherence and self-criticism. In a sport where every millisecond is measured with surgical precision, the fact that regulatory decisions depend on subjective perceptions and administrative silences is a systemic problem. One that not only affects the results, but also the credibility of the competition. What happened in Mexico was not a simple penalty. It was an implicit warning that, in today's Formula One, the regulations are a tool that can be shaped according to the context. And as long as that perception is not dispelled with concrete actions, the ghost of injustice will continue to be present in every corner, in every sanction, in every podium that is not celebrated. Ferrari's silence lasted less than expected. When it was confirmed that Lewis Hamilton had been removed from the podium due to a penalty that many considered arbitrary, the corridors of the Red Garage began to fill with palpable tension. It wasn't just disappointment. It was contained fury. Because for Ferrari, this was not simply a controversial decision. It was a slap to his credibility as a contender, a direct blow to the heart of his new project with Hamilton as its banner. What should have been the emotional turning point of the season abruptly became a brutal reminder that old ghosts still haunt Formula One. The Italian team, according to internal leaks, considered raising a formal protest, not so much with the intention of reversing the sanction. They knew that this was almost impossible, but to record what they consider a structural injustice. But the real concern was not only the punishment, but the precedent it left. A pilot sanctioned for an event with multiple interpretations, while others in similar or even more serious conditions went unpunished. Are we seeing an isolated problem or the tip of the iceberg of a system that needs profound reform? Can Formula One hope to be truly fair without rebuilding its refereeing architecture from the ground up? Let me know in the comments what you think about all this.